Good morning, 5th grade. We are going to move on to our next lesson in our multiplying and dividing decimals chapter. Today we're going to focus on multiplying decimals by whole numbers. Yesterday we talked about using rounding to estimate the products of equations where decimals were being multiplied by whole numbers. Today we're actually going to move on and learn how to do the exact process. Thank you. Let's get started. So there are a few basic rules when we're multiplying decimals by whole numbers. The biggest rule is that you basically multiply the same way you do when you multiply with whole numbers. That includes putting the number with the most digits on the top of the equation, even if it's not technically the largest number, but if it's the number with the most digits, place that on top. Then you multiply normally. Now, the only difference is when you get to your final answer, you're going to count the number of decimal places in your original equation and use that many decimal places in your final answer. Right now that all might sound a little bit confusing, but I'm going to do a couple examples. We're going to do some together and you'll do some on your own, and I think you'll pick it up pretty quickly. Let's look at the example below. 3 times 0.96 or 96 hundredths. If I look back up at my rules, I'm going to multiply these normally, but the thing that I need to do first is to put the number with the most digits on top, even if it's not the largest number. As I look at those two numbers, 0.96 has more digits than 3, so I'm going to put 0.96 on the top. 0.96. And yesterday we talked about the fact that when we are multiplying decimals, we no longer have to line up our decimal points, but rather line up our digits all the way to the right. So 0.96 times 3. See how I set up my digits aligned all the way to the right? Now I'm going to follow the third rule above, and I'm going to multiply normally. 3 times 6 is 18, carry the 1. 3 times 9 is 27, plus 1 is 28, carry the 2. 3 times 0 is 0, plus 2 is 2. Now, in addition, we used to just drop down our decimal point. We can no longer do that. Our rule is we need to go look in our original equation and figure out how many decimal places were in the original equation. What I normally do is go back and analyze both numbers and jump 1, 2 until I run into a decimal point. If I look at the number 3, there were no digits to the right of the decimal point, so there were no decimal places in the number 3. There were 2 decimal places in 0.96, and there were no decimal places in the number 3. So in this case, I go to my final answer, and I jump and place my decimal point 2 places in. Now, in this case, it looks as though you could simply just drop your decimal point down, but once we do a couple more examples as we move forward, you'll understand that you cannot simply drop your decimal point down. So before I actually begin to solve this in our video, I want you to think back to the rules that I just discussed, and I want you to figure out how you would even set up this problem before we actually even try and multiply. So the video is going to pause in a second, and in your journal you are going to write down in what order this equation should be solved, what this equation should look like when you solve it. Alright friends, so hopefully you took a minute to look in your journal and write down how you would solve this equation. So jumping back to the rules that we talked about before, we basically, when we are multiplying decimals by whole numbers, we basically multiply the same way we did when we were multiplying whole numbers, but we put the number with the most digits on top. Even though 0 in this equation is actually a placeholder, we would still look at this equation and say that 0.5 has more digits, so I'm going to put that number on top. So I'm going to say 0.5 times 6. Now, on the slide before, we talked about the fact that once we line up our decimal and our whole number aligned as far right as we can, not really paying any attention to the decimal points, we're going to multiply like normal. 6 times 5 is 30, carry the 3. 6 times 0 is 0, plus 3 is 3. Now I need to go back to my original equation and figure out how many decimal places or how many digits were to the right of the decimal places. There was 1 decimal place in 0.5, and there were no decimal places in the number 6. So that means I need to put 1 decimal place into my final answer. All right, my friends, you should have your journals out, and you are going to take a minute to solve the problem 4 times 2.6. I want you to do both an exact answer and use rounding and estimation to check the product, your exact product. So I want you to take a minute. The video is going to pause. You're going to set this up, and you are going to solve in your journal. Remember to follow the rules that we discussed earlier. Line everything up as far right as possible, put the number with the bigger digits on the top, multiply normally, and count your decimal points and place them into your final answer. Good luck. All right, my friends, here is the work that you should have completed or something similar to this in your journal. 2.6 times 4, the exact answer is 10.4. My estimate, I rounded 2.6 up to 3 and multiplied 3 times 4 and got about 12. An estimate of 12 and an exact of 10.4 is pretty close and pretty reasonable to me. Hopefully your journal looks quite like this. There's going to be one more quiz question after this, and then you are going to be moving on and doing a small group activity and some independent practice. What I want you to take away from today's lesson, friends, what I hope you took away from this lesson, friends, are the major rules for multiplying decimals for whole numbers. Simply, you multiply like you would with whole numbers. You line up your digits to the far right. You put the number with the most digits on top. Again, even if it is not the biggest number, but the number with the most digits, you place that on top. Then you multiply normally. You go back to the original equation once you've found your product and count the number of decimal places in the original equation, and you put that number of decimals into the final answer. We're going to move on, friends, and good luck.